So I thought I'd just ask you a few questions related to your books with us, and feel free to
Sure.
riff on it or whatever you like. But to start with the most recent one, the Essential Gnostic Scriptures that you did with Marvin Meyer.
Yeah.
Those texts have really mostly appeared in scholarly versions before this,
Mm-hmm.
and not in really a readable literary form. Why do you think it's important for ordinary people to be able to read these texts? Aren't they dry and confusing?
Oh gosh, talking about Pandora's box. Well, all literatures which have religious content originally were sung. We learned to sing before we could speak, and we certainly, I don't think there's any civilization where prose was invented before poetry. And in whether it's the Islamic, Jewish, Christian, Greek Orthodox, that is, whenever scriptures are read, they're chanted. And so part of the meaning is its subjective, literary, emotional beauty. And the translations of the Gnostics become a very strange exercise from the scholarly point of view of attempting to find, I'll give you a parallel, attempting to find out what Hamlet was reading in the libraries of Copenhagen in his spare moments to discover the real Hamlet's real character. When you look at, for example, one of the 53, if I remember correctly, scriptures from the Nag Hammadi Bible found in Egypt, one of them was a version of a Platonic dialogue. But the version, by the time it gets from Greek into Coptic and back into English, has nothing to do with Plato. Because when people translate in the past, they usually make it say what they wish it to say. When they copy in the past, that's the problem with any Bible. Each generation, at least in the past, changed it according to the political and religious needs of the time. Mm-hmm. And so we're dealing with texts which appeared probably in Greek, almost certainly in Greek, perhaps some in Syriac, which is a form of Aramaic, spoke church Aramaic in Syria, because Syria was, along with a few other places, especially Alexandria and Rome, main centers of Gnosticism. And as I was saying, it's their transfer into Coptic, they surely drastically changed. And so when we try to say, what did they really mean? We should accept the fact that we're dealing with a shadow of a shadow. It's good to know as much as we can. So I only say that to give us a little perspective that truth is never absolute, and certainly not in connotative texts, which are given to change. Now, given that, part of the translation of something which is not purely denotative, that is to say, business dimensions of property, or that doesn't allow discussion. It's either 12 feet or 13 feet. But once you get into language, fortunately language is infinitely changing, agrees with each person differently because we are subjective, depends on the time of day, and that's what makes language truths interesting. We're never bored because the truth always changes. And so, to be close to the original, we must make it change beautifully, because if the message was to get through, part of its message was its intelligibility and its beauty. If you lose both intelligibility and beauty in the translation, you have failed as a translator. You have no right to think you're a partner in remastering an original. So that's why I think it's important for a poet or a literary person who, at least in the moment of translation, to undertake a literary text. Would Emily Dickinson be happy if, I don't know, if someone other than a whimsical, profound person like herself were transmitting her stuff into a foreign tongue? No.
That's very beautifully put. This is going to be material for your panel tonight, I think, too.
We can just send the video. If you want.
And you can go out to dinner.
Anyway, I'm sorry I jabber.
No,
No,
it's interesting.
great.
It's very interesting.
That's why you're here.
Yeah, coming back to the, some people, when I was looking around for blurbs for Gnostic Bible and the other texts, I came up against this question with people I asked who disagreed about what a Gnostic is. There seemed to be a lot of disagreement about that. What do you say a Gnostic is?
Well, the word gnosis means to know, and Paul and the others, but especially Paul, who was profoundly influenced by the Gnostics. In fact, so were all the early churchmen who learned exegesis and any kind of analytical reading of texts from the Gnostics, who were much more highly educated. They were from sophisticated Alexandria, which was the most sophisticated country in the world, country, city, state. And Paul raged against the false teachers who will pervert your mind with gnosis, with knowledge. They were the Gnostics. For them, Paul was a Jew, but he was a Jew who believed that the Jewish Messiah had come. He knew nothing about Mary, and those ideas of the Gospels only were invented when the four Gospels were written, that is the canonical Gospels, between 75 and maybe, who knows, 110 AD. But Paul was really worried about the Gnostics. Every religious movement is always fighting every other religion. And the closer the people are in paternity or maternity, the more they are to be worried about. Yes, a Gnostic is someone who believes in, and I backtrack here to say that there's been what I would call rather insidious and stupid discussion about were they really Gnostics. The name doesn't mean anything. You change the name of a nation when you take over with power, but something remains. But there were people, there were movements, there were texts. If you want to call them the Bloomer Society, fine. They didn't use the word Greek, but we think the Greeks existed. The Gnostics are people who have the wonderful Promethean idea that Eve was good, not evil, that knowledge was within ourselves, not in the hands of a clergy, that an inner light like the Quakers is foremost, that peace is better than war. I think they had some good ideas. And the Gnostics, Julian the Apostate was hit by an arrow when he was 37. Otherwise, the history of religion would have been, he was the second after Constantine. He believed in Sappho rather than, he believed in a god whose spelling was Zeus. So, the same thing with the Gnostics. Supposedly Valentinus, the theoretical author of the Gospel of Truth, was to be the Pope, and lost slightly because they were worried about these people from Alexandria. Then again, papal history and Christianity would have been much better. Borges says beautifully in an essay on Basilides, he also has one on Judas. He knew all about it because he read Irenaeus. He knew about the history of Judas. Yeah, and his essay is called The Three Ways of Judas, by the way. Borges said in his essay about Basilides, if in Alexandria, if the Gnostics had won. These stories today, which we consider so mysterious, obscure, and perhaps heretical, would be perfectly normal. That's what a Gnostic is.
Would it be
The loser, as they were in France with the last of the great Gnostics, with the Neo-Manichaeans, the Cathars, who were systematically wiped out by the Albigensian Crusade in the early 13th century. And when that didn't wipe out 50% of southern France, they started the Inquisition, which they asked the Dominicans to carry out.
You mentioned the
No history really of the Gnostics, though their empire, so to speak, extended from Western China for 4 centuries, from the 9th to the 13th century, all the way to Portugal and most of North Africa, much of North Africa. After all, St. Augustine was a Gnostic missionary for 7 years before he became a Christian. He from Hippo, who went